There was no anger in the gorilla's voice, only quiet disappointment. And that hurt Grace more than any criticism ever could. She understood then that sadness can speak louder than rage, and this creature seemed saddened on behalf of humanity. The room was quiet in the way only research facilities ever are, a silence padded by glass walls and controlled breath. Grace sat near the window, massive shoulders relaxed, dark eyes following dust as it drifted through late afternoon light. No one expected anything from her that day. She was simply there, present, breathing, watching humans move as they always did. Grace had learned the rhythms of this place long ago. The soft click of keyboards meant focus. Lowered voices meant tension. When shoes stopped pacing, decisions had already been made somewhere she could not see. She watched it all without reacting, hands resting loosely in her lap, as if patience itself had weight, and she carried it easily. Dr. Emily Carter stood behind the glass, holding a tablet she had forgotten to turn on. She had been watching Grace for years, yet moments like this still unsettled her. Grace was not performing, not signaling, not responding to cues. She was simply observing. Emily had come to understand that these were the moments when Grace noticed the most. The other staff barely glanced her way. A visiting donor spoke softly to the director, discussing budgets and optics. Grace's name floated through the conversation like a label, not a presence. She tilted her head slightly, eyes tracking the movement of lips, not words. Something in her posture shifted, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not looking closely. Grace raised one hand, not abruptly, not for attention, just enough to interrupt the flow of the room. Emily felt it before she understood it, a tightening in her chest, the instinct that something important was about to happen. The donor stopped talking. The director frowned. No one told Grace to continue. She did anyway. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, forming signs Emily recognized, and others did not. They were not the practiced combinations Grace used during structured sessions. These were simpler, heavier. Earth, water, breath. The words landed in Emily's mind with an unfamiliar weight, like they had not been learned but carried. Someone laughed softly, uncertain. Another person shifted uncomfortably. Grace did not look at them. Her gaze stayed fixed on the glass, on her own reflection layered faintly over the humans watching her. She paused, hands lowering, then lifted them again with a steadiness that quieted the room completely. Emily's pulse quickened as Grace continued. Forget. Take. Break. The signs were clear, but the meaning behind them felt dangerously large. This was not a response to a question. No one had asked her anything. Grace was not reacting. She was initiating, and that alone fractured the unspoken rules of the room. For a brief moment, Emily saw fear ripple through the humans present. Not fear of Grace, but of implication. If this was communication, it was not safe or flattering. Grace's hands slowed, her breathing deepened, as if she were choosing each motion carefully, aware that this moment would not repeat itself. Then it happened. Grace touched her chest, then extended her hand outward. Feel. Hurt. Together. Emily felt tears rise before she understood why. The message was not angry. That was the most unsettling part. It carried no threat, only recognition, as if Grace had been watching for a very long time and had finally decided to speak. The director cleared his throat. Someone whispered that this should be documented later, reframed properly. Grace lowered her hands. The moment passed, fragile and irreversible. The room resumed breathing. Shoes shifted again. The donor checked his watch. But something essential had already broken open, and no one said it out loud. Grace turned away from the glass and looked toward the window, where the forest stood in quiet contrast to the building behind her. Her shoulders eased. Whatever she had carried out into the open no longer belonged to her alone. Emily watched her go, knowing this was not the beginning of a study, but the start of a reckoning no one had prepared for. Grace woke before the light, the house holding its breath around her. Morning pressed gently against the windows, pale and unsure. She moved through the kitchen by memory, hands steady, thoughts drifting. The world felt quieter lately, as if it were waiting for her to decide something she had been putting off for years. She carried her coffee to the porch and sat, listening to the low hum of the neighborhood. Every sound felt sharper now. The clink of a distant gate, a bird clearing its throat, the old boards beneath her feet. Grace noticed how time slowed when she paid attention, how it asked her to stay instead of rushing past. She thought of the words from yesterday, how they landed and refused to leave. They circled her mind with a stubborn patience. Grace had lived long enough to know that some moments arrive dressed as accidents, yet behave like invitations. This one felt heavy, but also strangely kind. By mid-morning she drove without a plan, letting the road choose for her. Trees blurred into a soft green wall, and the sky stretched wide and forgiving. Grace felt her chest tighten, then ease, like a tide pulling back. She realized she had been holding herself rigid, bracing for a blow that never quite came. At a red light, a memory surfaced without warning. Her younger self, confident and quick to speak, believing the world would always listen. The memory stung, not from regret, but from recognition. Grace smiled faintly, understanding how much courage it had taken just to become who she was now. When she reached the place she had been avoiding, her hands trembled. The building looked smaller than she remembered, almost gentle. Grace paused before going in, breathing slow and deep. Fear rose, sharp and familiar, then softened into something like resolve. Inside, the air carried a hush that felt respectful. Grace listened more than she spoke, absorbing every detail. The truth revealed itself in pieces, not loud or dramatic, but steady. It pressed on her heart until tears came, quiet and unashamed, marking the center of the day. The emotional weight peaked there, heavy and undeniable. Grace felt cracked open, yet stronger for it. She understood now what had been asked of her, and why it could not wait. Pain and clarity stood side by side, neither canceling the other, both insisting on honesty. Later she walked back into the afternoon light, changed in small ways. The sun felt warmer, the breeze more personal. Grace noticed how the world kept moving, indifferent yet beautiful. It comforted her to know life did not pause for sorrow, but carried it gently along. She returned home slower than before, letting the day settle. In the quiet living room, she sat and allowed herself to rest. Grace felt older, yes, but also lighter. Experience had stripped away what no longer served her, leaving something truer behind. As evening approached, she made peace with the unanswered questions. Not everything needed to be solved today. Grace trusted that understanding would continue to unfold, patient as the seasons. The thought eased her shoulders and softened her breath. When night finally came, she turned off the lights and stood by the window. The darkness did not frighten her. It felt like a pause, not an ending. Grace carried the day inside her, knowing tomorrow would meet her with its own quiet truths. Grace arrived earlier than expected, the sanctuary quieter than usual, as if the day itself was holding its breath. She moved slowly, not from fear, but from a growing awareness that something familiar was slipping away. The routine she once trusted no longer steadied her.
Every step felt deliberate, as though the ground beneath her had subtly shifted overnight. She paused near the observation area, resting her hand against the railing. Eli Gorilla sat across the space, still and composed, his presence calm in a way that unsettled her. Grace told herself she was imagining things, projecting meaning where none existed. Yet the silence between them felt charged, thick with something unspoken that refused to remain distant. Caleb spoke quietly behind her, explaining behaviors, patterns, data points he'd cataloged for years. Grace listened, nodding when expected, but her attention kept drifting back. She wasn't watching an animal anymore. She was watching a presence. The distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit, and that realization tightened her chest. When Eli Gorilla shifted, his movement was measured, intentional. Grace felt it before she understood it. This was not reaction. This was choice. The thought landed heavily, pressing against everything she had been taught to believe. Her breath slowed, not in panic, but in awe edged
with discomfort. For a moment, she remembered simpler explanations. Instinct, conditioning, coincidence. They had always been enough before. Now they felt thin, like explanations borrowed from a world that no longer quite fit. Grace sensed the edge of something vast and unfamiliar, and she hesitated, afraid of what stepping closer might demand of her. Lena joined them briefly, her expression cautious but gentle. She offered reassurance without certainty, and that unsettled Grace more than doubt ever could. If even the experts were careful with their words, then perhaps this wasn't a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was a reckoning, slow and deliberate, unfolding right in front of her. Grace returned her gaze to Eli Gorilla and found it held. There was no challenge there, no threat, only awareness. The moment stretched and something inside her shifted. She felt seen in a way that stripped away comfort and replaced it with responsibility. The emotional weight surprised her with its quiet intensity. Her thoughts raced, then stilled. If this awareness was real, then it changed the question entirely. It wasn't what he could do. It was what humans had failed to notice for so long. The idea struck deeply, not as accusation, but as an invitation she wasn't sure she deserved. She stepped back, pressing her fingers together, grounding herself. The world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. Yet something essential had cracked open. Grace felt smaller, but also more awake. The contradiction lingered, unsettling and honest, refusing to resolve into something neat. As the visit ended, the sanctuary returned to its usual rhythm. Sounds resumed, movement continued, but Grace carried the stillness with her, like a quiet echo. The experience had not demanded belief. It had demanded attention, and that felt far more dangerous. Outside, the air felt different against her skin. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Grace understood now that curiosity came with consequence. Once seen, certain truths could not be unseen, and she had crossed a threshold without ceremony or permission. She left with no answers, only a growing sense that the boundary she once trusted was dissolving. The realization didn't frighten her as much as she expected. Instead, it settled gently, like a question waiting patiently. And Grace knew she would return, because some truths, once felt, asked to be faced again. Grace woke before dawn, the house still holding its breath. Pale light slid across the kitchen floor, touching the chair where she used to sit with her hands wrapped around warm mugs. Mornings had become careful rituals now. Quiet steps meant not to wake memories that felt heavier than furniture and far less willing to stay put. She drove without music, letting the road speak instead. The town thinned into open fields,
then trees, then a stretch of highway that always made her feel small. With every mile, she sensed something loosening inside her chest, like a knot, slowly.
Admitting it had been tied too tight for too long. At the research center, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain. Grace signed in, nodded at familiar faces, and followed the corridor she knew by heart. Each step felt ordinary, yet charged, as if the walls themselves were waiting to hear what she would say, or what might be said to her in return. The enclosure was calm when she arrived. The gorilla sat quietly, massive and still, eyes alert but gentle. Grace took her seat, clipboard resting uselessly on her lap. She had learned that listening mattered more than writing, especially when silence carried its own kind of language. She spoke softly at first, words chosen for comfort rather than purpose. She talked about the sky that morning, the way the clouds looked undecided. The gorilla watched her closely, head tilted slightly, as if weighing not just her voice, but the feeling beneath it. When the response came, it was unhurried. A few simple signs, a pause, then another. The message was not loud or dramatic, yet it landed with surprising force. It spoke of humans chasing noise, mistaking motion for meaning, forgetting how to sit with what hurts until it teaches them something true. Grace felt the words settle deep, stirring places she had sealed off. Her breath caught, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The room blurred as memories rose, of choices made too quickly, of grief rushed through instead of honored, of love treated like a task to finish. Her hands trembled, and she lowered her gaze. The gorilla did not look away. There was no judgment there, only patience. That steadiness broke something open in her, and tears came without drama, slow and honest, the kind that ask for nothing except time. She spoke again, voice thinner now, admitting fears she rarely named. About growing older, about being useful, about whether humans still knew how to listen to the world they kept reshaping. Saying it aloud felt risky, but also strangely relieving, like setting down a weight she had carried out of habit. The answer was simple. Care comes before control. Listen before fixing. The signs were deliberate, almost tender. Grace nodded, absorbing the truth she already knew, but had needed to hear from somewhere unexpected, somewhere untouched by human hurry. When the session ended, she lingered. The day outside had fully arrived, light pooling at the windows. She felt changed, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested direction, as if a compass inside her had finally stopped spinning and chosen a north. Driving home, Grace let the radio stay off. The road felt different now, less like an escape and more like a return. She carried the message quietly, knowing it would not solve everything. Still, it softened the edges of her thoughts, offering a gentler way forward. That evening, she sat on her porch as the sun slipped away. The world hummed softly, insects tuning up for night. Grace breathed in, unafraid of the silence. For the first time in a long while, she trusted that listening, truly listening, might be enough to begin again. Grace began the day slowly, letting morning light settle into the rooms without interruption. She brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching steam rise like a quiet thought she did not rush to finish. Since the last visit, her mind had been fuller, yet calmer, as if something important had been placed back where it belonged. At the center, word had spread without ceremony. Colleagues greeted her with curious glances, careful not to pry. Grace felt the weight of being noticed, though nothing about her felt louder. She moved through the halls with the same steady pace, aware that listening had changed her posture, her patience, the way she carried time. The enclosure greeted her with its familiar stillness. The gorilla sat closer today, presence filling the space in a way that felt grounding rather than imposing. Grace sat down and waited, resisting the urge to speak first. Silence felt like an agreement now, not an absence, but a shared starting point. When she finally spoke, her words were less about observation and more about reflection. She described how humans measure days by output, not meaning, how even rest is scheduled, justified, earned. The gorilla listened, eyes steady, hands relaxed, as if these confessions belonged to both of them. The reply came carefully, shaped by pauses that mattered. Humans forget grief is a teacher, not an error. They hurry away from discomfort and call it strength. The message settled hard. Grace felt her chest tighten, realizing how often she had done exactly that, stepping around pain instead of through it. A memory surfaced without warning. A hospital room years ago, sunlight on white sheets, words she never finished saying. Grace inhaled sharply, the room tilting as emotion crested. Tears came again, heavier this time, carrying regret and love tangled together, demanding to be felt all at once. She covered her face, shoulders shaking, no longer trying to stay composed. The gorilla remained still, offering no comfort except presence. That restraint felt profound. Grace understood then that healing did not require fixing or soothing. It required space and permission to remain with what hurts. When she lifted her head, her voice was steadier, changed by release. She asked quietly what humans were missing most. The answer was simple and devastating. Time spent noticing each other without agenda. Time allowed to be unproductive. Time that tells the truth. The emotional peak softened into clarity. Grace felt something shift from sorrow to resolve. She could not undo the past, but she could choose differently now. Listening, she realized, was not passive. It was an active refusal to rush, to dominate, to escape the weight of being human. The session ended gently. Grace thanked the gorilla, words feeling small but sincere. As she stood to leave, she felt taller, not with pride, but with purpose. The corridor outside seemed less sterile, more human, filled with quiet possibilities she had overlooked before. Driving home, traffic moved slowly, yet she did not mind. Faces in nearby cars looked tired, distracted, hopeful. Grace wondered how many carried unspoken grief, how many longed to be heard without interruption. The thought stayed with her, tender and unresolved. That evening, she called an old friend she had avoided for years. The conversation was simple, uneven, real. No advice, no solutions, just listening. When they hung up, Grace felt the day settle into her bones, heavy but right. As night fell, she sat alone with the lights low, breathing evenly. The message remained with her, not as a warning, but as an invitation. Grace understood that change would come quietly, through attention and care. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Grace woke before the alarm, the house still wrapped in early quiet. She lay still, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beginning its slow crawl. Nothing urgent pressed at her. The calm felt earned, fragile, like something she needed to carry carefully through the day. At work, routine tasks unfolded without friction. Emails answered, notes filed, meetings attended. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, Grace sensed a deeper awareness guiding her choices. She paused before speaking, listened longer than required. People noticed, not because she changed dramatically, but because her presence felt steadier, less rushed. When she arrived at the enclosure, she felt a subtle resistance in her chest. Not fear, but anticipation. The gorilla waited, posture relaxed, eyes alert. Grace sat and let the moment settle.
She realized she no longer came seeking answers. She came to understand what listening might ask of her next. Their exchange began gently. Grace spoke about humans filling silence with noise, afraid of what might surface if they slowed down. She admitted how difficult it was to sit with uncertainty, how often control masqueraded as responsibility. Saying it aloud made the truth sharper, harder to ignore. The gorilla responded with deliberate calm. Humans confuse movement with progress. Stillness frightens them because it reveals who they are without distraction. The words struck deep. Grace felt a familiar tightening, recognizing how often she hid behind activity to avoid facing her own unanswered questions. Emotion swelled unexpectedly, a sense of loss, not tied to one memory, but many. Relationships thinned by busyness, moments postponed until later that never came. Grace's breathing faltered as the weight of cumulative neglect pressed in. Tears gathered, fueled by the realization that time does not wait for readiness. She pressed her hands together, grounding herself. The gorilla remained quiet, offering no interruption. That silence felt heavier than words, urging her to stay present. Grace understood that grief was not only about what was gone, but about what
she had failed to protect while it was still near. At the emotional peak, clarity cut through the ache. Grace saw how often she postponed living fully, promising herself space and care once things slowed down. But they never did. The pain sharpened into resolve. She could not reclaim lost moments, but she could refuse to lose more. Her voice steadied as she spoke again. She asked how humans might begin to change without grand gestures. The answer was almost gentle. Pay attention to what you rush past. That is where meaning hides. Grace felt the truth of it settle, simple yet demanding. The intensity eased, leaving a thoughtful quiet. Grace thanked the gorilla, not with ceremony, but with sincerity. She stood and felt the ground beneath her feet more clearly than before. The room seemed unchanged, yet her way of standing within it had shifted. Outside, the day carried on with its usual noise. Grace moved through it differently, noticing small details she once dismissed. A shared smile, a held door, a moment of patience. These were not solutions, but beginnings. She let that be enough for now. That night, she wrote a short note to herself, not a plan, but a reminder. Slow down, stay present, listen without needing to respond. As she turned off the light, Grace felt a quiet resolve take root, knowing the work ahead would be slow, but real. Grace found herself moving more slowly now, not out of fatigue, but intention. Morning light slipped across her kitchen table as she made coffee, and she didn't rush past it. She stood there, hands wrapped around the mug, letting warmth settle into her palms. The day no longer felt like something chasing her. It waited, quietly. At work, conversations felt different. Grace listened without planning her replies. She noticed pauses, the way people searched for words when given time. There was less urgency in her gestures, less need to fill space. Some colleagues seemed surprised, others relieved. Calm, she realized, could be contagious. When she returned to the sanctuary, the air felt familiar, almost welcoming. She didn't hurry toward the enclosure. Each step carried awareness. Leaves shifted underfoot. Distant sounds blended into a low rhythm. Grace felt grounded in her body, present in a way she hadn't been for years. The gorilla sat where he often did, powerful, yet still. Grace took her place, not as a visitor, but as someone returning to a shared understanding. She spoke about change, how subtle it felt at first, almost unnoticeable. How slowing down revealed both beauty and discomfort she had long ignored. His response was measured. Humans expect transformation to arrive loudly. They overlook the quiet work
of becoming. Grace felt a tightening in her chest. She thought of how often she dismissed small efforts, waiting for certainty before acting. The realization stung, sharp but honest. Emotion rose as she spoke of fear. Fear of doing too little. Fear of being seen clearly, without busyness as a shield.
Her voice wavered, carrying years of restraint. She admitted how hard it was to sit with herself when nothing demanded her attention. The gorilla listened, unblinking. Then came words that struck deeply. Discomfort is not failure. It is the beginning of awareness. Grace felt tears gather again, but these were different. Less about loss, more about recognition. She wasn't broken. She was waking up. At the emotional peak, Grace felt exposed, yet steady. Memories surfaced of moments she rushed through, people she half heard. The weight of it pressed down, heavy but clarifying. She allowed herself to feel it fully, no longer pushing it aside for the sake of composure. Silence followed, long and unforced. Grace breathed through it, feeling something settle inside her. Not answers, but acceptance. Change didn't require perfection. It required honesty, repeated daily in small, deliberate ways. She spoke softly again, asking how humans might sustain this awareness without losing it to habit. The answer came simply: return to what you feel, not what you plan. Grace nodded, sensing the truth in her bones. As the intensity eased, the space felt lighter. Grace stood with a quiet confidence, no longer searching for something outside herself. She thanked the gorilla, her voice steady, grateful not just for the words, but for the silence that held them. Leaving the sanctuary, the world seemed unchanged, yet richer. Grace noticed faces, gestures, brief connections. None of it dramatic, all of it meaningful. She felt no rush to share what she'd learned. Some truths, she understood, needed to be lived first. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Grace sat alone and felt contentment without excitement. Just a gentle steadiness. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she trusted the pace. Grace woke before dawn, not from worry, but from a gentle sense of readiness. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. She moved through familiar rooms without turning on lights, letting memory guide her steps. There was no urgency in her morning, only a calm awareness that something had settled, deeply and finally. Outside, the sky held that soft blue just before sunrise. Grace sat on the porch, wrapped in a light sweater, listening to distant birds begin their calls. She thought about how often she once filled mornings with noise, news, and plans. Now silence felt like a companion rather than a void. At the sanctuary later that day, Grace didn't seek answers. She came to witness. The familiar paths no longer felt like routes toward revelation, but part of a shared landscape she belonged to. Each sound, each movement, carried a sense of continuity, life unfolding without commentary. The gorilla noticed her presence but did not shift dramatically. Their connection no longer needed ceremony. Grace spoke about ordinary things, how she'd watched neighbors help each other after a storm, how patience seemed rarer yet more necessary than ever. Her voice carried steadiness instead of searching. Then the conversation turned, gently but firmly, toward responsibility. Not blame, not accusation, but ownership. The gorilla's words pressed into a place Grace recognized. Humans often wait for permission to care deeply. They mistake distance for safety. The truth landed heavy, unmistakable. Emotion rose as Grace reflected on her own life. The years she stayed quiet when her voice mattered. The times she chose comfort over courage. Her chest tightened, breath catching slightly. This wasn't regret meant to punish her. It was clarity, sharp and cleansing. She spoke of fear again, but differently now. Fear not as an enemy, but a signal, something asking for attention. The gorilla responded that fear, when acknowledged, could guide rather than paralyze. Grace felt the weight of that truth settle, anchoring itself in her bones. At the emotional peak, Grace allowed herself to grieve, not loudly, not dramatically, but fully. Grief for missed moments, for collective blindness, for the cost of indifference. Tears came and went, leaving behind a quiet strength she hadn't known before. Silence followed, deep and unbroken. Grace didn't rush to fill it. She breathed, letting the moment pass through her. In that stillness, she felt connected not just to the gorilla, but to something wider. A shared responsibility, shared fragility. When she finally spoke again, her words were simple. She asked how to move forward without losing herself to despair. The answer came softly. Act where you stand. Care without spectacle. Grace nodded, feeling the practicality of it ease her heart. As the intensity faded, warmth replaced it. Not optimism, but resolve. Grace stood, stretching slightly, feeling her age and her strength together. She thanked the gorilla, not as a student thanking a teacher, but as one witness acknowledging another. On her way home, the world felt textured and close. Faces at the grocery store, a child laughing in a parking lot, an older man pausing to catch his breath. Grace noticed without judgment. Presence, she realized, was its own quiet act of care. That evening, Grace wrote in her journal, not to record revelations, but to mark commitment, small actions, daily awareness, honest reflection. The page didn't need to impress anyone. It only needed to remind her who she chose to be. As night settled, Grace turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, unafraid. The story didn't end with answers or certainty. It ended with attention, with a woman willing to listen, to feel, and to live differently. And that, she knew, was enough to begin. Before you leave, take a quiet moment and ask yourself one question. Did this story feel true to you, or did it make you uncomfortable? If it felt true, simply type 1 in the comments. If it made you uncomfortable, type 0. You don't need to explain. Sometimes a single number says enough. And if you'd like to hear more stories that gently question the world we live in, stories meant to be listened to slowly, please consider subscribing to the channel. New stories are waiting, and the next one might stay with you even longer. Thank you for listening.